Hi, good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I'm Doug Cha, the Executive Director of the Conference Board Governance Center, and I want to welcome you to this edition of Governance Watch, our webcast series that we host in collaboration with the law firm of Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen & Hamilton. Today, as we are fast approaching proxy season, or maybe already into it, we want to reflect a little bit on some of the developments that took place in the 2018 proxy season, but mostly talk about what we see coming for the 2019 season, including compensation, ESG, diversity, disclosure issues. To do that, I'm pleased to be joined by three guests who are always on the front lines of these discussions and activities with their corporate clients. Sandra Flo, Mary Alcock, and Ann Chapman. And so Sandra is a frequent guest on the program. She's a partner at Cleary Gottlieb, and she focuses on capital markets and corporate governance. Mary Alcock is counsel at Cleary Gottlieb, and her practice focuses on employee benefits and executive compensation matters, including the design and regulatory compliance. And Ann Chapman, who is joining us from California. She is a managing director at the strategic corporate communications firm Joel Frank, Wilkinson, Brimmer, and Catcher. And she focuses on corporate governance, investor relations, and shareholder communications with directors. Prior to being at Joel Frank, Ann was the Vice President of Investment Operations at Capital Research and Management Company, a subsidiary of Capital Group. Before we begin, I just need to go through some housekeeping items. First of all, we're offering CPE and New York CLE credit for live participation. To get credit, you need to stay on for the entire webcast. And for CPE, you'll need to enter your full name, email address, and specify CPE in the request CPE credit space at the bottom of your screen. There'll be 3 pop-up messages during the course of the program, and you will have to click OK for each of them. For New York CLE credit, download the CLE verification form and evaluation posted in the download section at the bottom of your screen, and then email them to Cleary Gottlieb at the email that's indicated on the form. And I'll provide a verification code later in the webcast, which you will need to write on the form to get the credit. There's a set of materials in the download section at the bottom of the screen provided by Cleary. We encourage audience participation in the program. There is a field for you to enter questions, which I will try to work in during the course of the program. Like I said, there's a slide deck to download. You can enlarge the video to full screen. Please do complete the evaluation for us to improve our future webcasts and get ideas. And you will be able to share this program on demand a little bit after it's finished. We'll post it on the website, and you can share the link with your colleagues. So let me get started with the substance that we're going to cover. First of all, shareholder proposals. Sandra, maybe you just want to talk a little bit about the key areas from 2018 and what you think we can expect in 2019.
Sure, and thanks so much for having me join today. So last year we saw, as we did really the year before, a surge in environmental and social issues. Governance proposals continue to be there. They continue to be part of the landscape, and I think that'll probably continue. But the E and S parts of ESG really had an uptick, and I think that'll probably continue. I think we'll be focusing a little bit more specifically on the environmental and social areas, but I would expect that to continue, particularly with all of the related issues this year, sort of in the landscape for the country as a whole. Climate change obviously is big. Diversity, key issues, and there are a variety of social issues. So I'm sure we'll talk about all of those more in depth.
And then have you seen, in terms of engaging with shareholder proponents, obviously that's something that's developed over time, anything new in terms of best practices or things that you're recommending this season in particular?
I'm not sure there's really much that's new, although Anne will have a perspective on that as well, of course. Continues to be important to engage with your key shareholder base. It's starting to be part of the off-season routine, and we're really heading into the proxy season. So we're kind of at the end of those engagements, really. What I always hear from investors is try not to just come in and try to talk about your one issue that's a problem that particular year. They want to hear more about your whole strategy, and not just, oh, please vote for this one particular issue. I would say it's important to listen. Investors really want to be heard. And I think it continues to be the case that people need to be prepared to bring a director.
Got it.
But Anne would probably have.
And what about any things that you've been seeing in your practice or advice that you're giving your clients these days for engagement with the proponents?
Well, Sandra, you really caught the first one, and that is listen. So we always tell people to be prepared to listen, because that's as important as making your point. Certainly the number of meetings that include a director is increasing, and having a director at least on offer is very much the expectation, I think, for most shareholders. The other thing that we talk about with clients, and it goes to having a more fulsome conversation, talk about what's very specific to your company. So if you do have a proposal, it's a similar governance or ESG proposal as many firms would get. Don't make the same old arguments that everybody else does. Talk about what the impact really is on your business and what the special circumstances are for your company. To be very colloquial, personalize it and give a whole sense, and often it does tie into strategy and approach.
Okay, great. Mary, with the shareholder proposals related to executive compensation, there's been a large downturn since say on pay votes started. Mm-hmm. Any different trends that you anticipate for the upcoming season?
The only trend that I'm sort of expecting, going out on a little bit of a limb, is combining, as Sandra said, the interest in, for example, climate change and sustainability. The one shareholder proposal I'm wondering a lot about is proposals aiming for tying executive compensation to those kinds of topics, to sustainability, especially now with Glass Lewis adopting SASB's sustainability guidelines. It gives proponents, I think, something to sort of grab onto and to specify if they wanted to tie executive compensation to those guidelines and how they perceive the company meeting them. Beyond that, I think we'll get a handful of the usual, trying to restrict golden parachutes. There was a flurry of proposals recently about adjusting or not adjusting, the results of performance measures, for example, with respect to the costs of stock being given out to employees in the context of compensation. I don't think those types of proposals are going away, but I haven't heard of any sort of one new hot topic. Mm-hmm. So if I do, you'll be the first to know.
What about, I kind of thought that there might be some proposals related to sexual harassment, either policies or oversight, in light of everything that people have been talking about for the last year or 18 months. I don't know if you've seen any evidence of that kind of proposal?
I haven't, but I would not be at all surprised.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. They could try to tie it to executive compensation, via a clawback, for example.
Sure.
Which events in the news would suggest is on people's minds. But I wonder if you're really trying to go after the sexual harassment, I'm thinking it's going to be more of an ES, well, not E, more of an S type shareholder proposal, trying to bring or make the board of directors more directly responsible for oversight of sexual harassment policies and implementation.
Sure.
There were sorry, go
I
ahead.
would agree with. I would agree with Mary, and I wonder if it's the human capital management issue. So looking at an overall approach to managing your employees, your associates, and then the attendant risk, perhaps, in not having a policy that is quite as robust.
Okay. Well, let's see. I think we'll see over the next couple of weeks, as most companies still have a couple of weeks in terms of the deadlines for shareholder proposals. Let's go into staff legal bulletins that been kind of very relevant these days. Obviously, last year we had SLAB 14I, which talked about board involvement in the shareholder proposal thought process. And this year we have 14J, which gives some feedback and interpretation of what took place over the last year, since it was somewhat confusing in terms of what the no action letters were telling us. Sandra, how do you see this playing out in terms of what you see from the guidance and how you think that might affect disclosures or no action letters and how they're written going forward?
Right. Yes, the staff legal bulletin 14I, I think, gave a lot of people what turned out to be maybe false hope that the SEC was trying to signal a more a company-friendly approach, sort of giving a nod to, if you involve your board and you put that into your no action request, that maybe the SEC would really give a fair amount of weight to that. And it turned out that a lot of no action letter requests made on that basis were denied. So last year there was really kind of a lot of confusion about what was this intended to be, and there were a few that were successful, but not a lot, right? So 14J, I think, is the staff's attempt to give a little more clarity on what they were looking for. Particularly, so it relates to two particular kinds of requests to exclude a shareholder proposal from the proxy. One is the I-5 basis, which is economic relevance, basically materiality, and the second is I-7, ordinary business. The SEC particularly laid out a number of factors that they want to see when you're talking about your board's involvement and the decision that the board has made in the context of that economic relevance, immateriality basis. They laid out a bunch of factors that they want to see in the discussion, to see the board having thought about. That includes quantitative data. Now that makes some sense where you're arguing that this is really not relevant for us, it's immaterial. So trying to see quantitatively how that plays out for the company. Really being definitive about the factors that the board considered, how the company has addressed the issue if they have, how maybe there have been potentially past shareholder engagement or proposals on the topic, being very careful about any company disclosures or statements that have already been made on the topic. The SEC noted that there have been some inconsistencies, and so really trying to avoid those. But so I think in that realm, the message is a lot of detail, a lot of more quantitative data, and the no action letter requests last year that were successful did in fact take that kind of an approach. I think what that means for a board is at a very early stage having to focus, have it on the agenda, actually have a detailed discussion at a meeting, which quite honestly in the context of dealing with a shareholder proposal is fairly rare. So I think for companies to be able to do this, it'll take a little bit of a change for their board practice. On the ordinary business exception, there's a little less, I think, there in terms of overall guidance, sort of talking about a two-pronged test that they're going to apply, the subject matter of the proposal, but also the level of micromanagement of the company, and that's maybe the part that sort of adds a little bit more gloss and is helpful. Whether the proposal, so their words are, probes complex matters and involves intricate detail, seeks to impose specific timeframes or methods for implementing complex policies. So if you're looking at something that the proposal seems to involve something very complex and very detailed, that's going to be sort of a potential candidate for this. I think though it also plays out in the comp area, that particular
actually,
one.
I thought my section of 14J was the most interesting in some ways. I completely agree with what Sandra said, and I think the SEC was reacting to the, oh, give me a no action letter, because, yeah, our board talked about it, and they're sort of saying, you're really going to show it. But in the exec comp arena, with the comments that they made, in a way seemed to cut the other way. They seemed addressed to shareholders, saying, if you're trying to get at a bigger, maybe human capital or employee company-wide compensation issue, don't put a fig leaf of executive compensation in there in order to get past our, anything to do with executive compensation isn't ordinary business. So they specifically said that in trying to determine whether, shareholders were attempting form over substance using this approach, that they would look at the resolve statement and the supporting statement, which I thought was very interesting, that they actually bothered to point out that, just because your resolution doesn't mention execs, or does mention execs, if the supporting statement is all about the broader population, they're gonna twig to that. They also went out of their way to say that although it is always it's been held for a long time that anything to do with executive compensation or director compensation was sort of inherently not ordinary business because it rose to one of those important governance subject matters. They underline the micromanagement aspect of it, which I thought was very interesting, and again, sort of going out of their way to point that out, not just in the more general ordinary business section, but also signaling that they would be paying attention to that in the exec comp proposals as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was interesting that, in the no action letters and then in this legal bulletin, they made it clear that, look, even if the board considered this stuff till the cows came home and you've got tons of disclosure, that doesn't mean that doesn't mean they're really going to take that into account that much. It seems like, look, SEC is going to still feel free to override the decision of the board as they deem appropriate. So
I think that's right. I think there's a tone setting in the new staff legal bulletin that is different than the one in the prior year, that I think is exactly that. The SEC trying to address that expectation and say, here's how we would be more likely to grant this. There's some detailed factors, and that here's your roadmap. But by the way, don't count on it.
I think it ended up not being as easy as people thought in terms of deference to the board.
Yeah,
I will hand it to the SEC though. They did put in the nice sentence saying, but not putting anything in about your board, basically won't cut against you. Which I think is going to be a relief to a lot of companies who,
Although they caveated that too, so query. I agree.
But I think again they're just sort of saying,
but
don't try and drag your board in last minute, just so you can say you dragged them in last minute.
So let's turn to some of the environmental, social, and governance proposals. And you expect to see anything different or any trends that started in 2018 that you think we're going to see more pronounced in 2019?
Well, I think it's pretty noteworthy that as we think about ESG, the focus really has swung away from G and is much more on the E and the S. Whether it's because there's a pretty good saturation of those governance provisions that have been commonly accepted as best practice, that people are shifting. I think that environmental and social proposals do get the lion's share likely going ahead. We were talking before the webcast that Jim McRitchie has come out and said, in addition to focusing on governance proposals, which have really been his bread and butter, he's looking at more of the environmental and social. So I think that shift in what's been termed the Cheveton group might be interesting to watch. As we see sort of early filings for this next year, environmental proposals, including climate change and scenario planning, I think we should expect to see some additional proposals on diversity, perhaps not just limited to the board, but workplace diversity. And I've heard a lot of people talking about gender pay parity, whether that results in a lot of shareholder proposals or just scrutiny remains to be seen. And I think there likely is still to be a focus on boards, both the diversity issue, which has primarily been focused on gender, but also on qualifications, the board attributes.
And so when you said scenario planning, what can you give a little more definition around that?
Well, I think that's for a specific sector. So if you are in the energy, the oil and gas, how you plan ahead for the likelihood of the 2-degree scenario, for what potentially might happen to your business if, say, fossil fuels aren't an option or there are continued regulatory pressures. So just how you're incorporating all of these different pressures as management and the board thinks about strategy.
So really
forward.
Risk mitigation of these externalities as opposed to, here's a report on all the good things that we're doing.
Absolutely. I think it's just as important to acknowledge the pressure and how companies are dealing with it. In fact, what I see is that many companies have an even better story on what they're not doing or what they're planning for the future as they do for the more feel-good initiatives.
Sandra, anything that you're seeing in particular?
I completely agree with what Ann was just saying, and I think the interesting thing also will be not just in the shareholder engagement and proposal landscape. I think companies generally will be focusing on this area. I mean, that's what the SEC has always kind of focused on for disclosure, that you should be really thinking about talking about risks, talking about your strategy. But I think this year companies will be taking a fresh look at that. I think they'll be really trying to make sure that their disclosure is really appropriately addressing that landscape. And I think that will tie in, I think shareholders will also want to be seeing that echo what they're hearing in the engagement, right? So I think there'll be a fair amount of focus this year, and it wouldn't surprise me at all, and this is a total guess, this is not based on anything I've actually heard, but it wouldn't surprise me at all to have this be an area that the SEC focuses on in comments following the 10K season.
Comment letters on your 10K
on the disclosures,
and your proxy
so
statement.
I think it's an area sort of as a whole that is going to have a lot of attention put on it.
Yeah, and perhaps we can even throw comments on cyber disclosure about
Put that
cyber
in there
risk.
too. I totally agree. Yeah, no, we should have mentioned that as one of the areas of focus. Yeah, completely agree.
Mary, what about any ties to compensation that we're seeing from ESG that you're noticing in particular?
Well, the one as I mentioned earlier, trying to tie compensation, executive compensation, to some of these ES topics, be it sustainability or as we discussed, maybe clawbacks in the context of sexual harassment. I think it's going to be. I think this year, and again, not based on anything I've specifically seen, but I think this year, actually, for the first time, probably in a long time, exec comp isn't going to be tip top. I really think it's going to be environmental and social in a broader sense, and which why I thought that the SEC saying, don't use exact comp to try to sneak in other things, I thought was quite timely. So I'm interested to see what happens, but I think that both the shareholder proposals and also, frankly, the proxy disclosure is going to be, I see focus shifting to the E and the S for really the first time in quite some time, at least proxy disclosure-wise.
And so, one thing that has popped up is that Glass Lewis announced a plan to disclose or include SASB disclosure guidance in its proxy voting reports. And from an investor perspective, how significant is this, and how might it affect how an investor looks at those Glass Lewis voting reports?
Well, I think it's a bit of a broader issue. There is a real need to sift through all of the various ratings agencies, if you will. There's quite a bit of information, particularly on ESG, but the ratings, for example, I think the two that commonly are talked about is MSCI and Sustainalytics. As we talk both to companies and to shareholders, there's some frustration that the data is sometimes not well scrubbed. There aren't specific criteria. There isn't an agreed upon set of metrics, for example, that you can point to determine whether a company has a high social or environmental score. In fact, the agencies often disagree with themselves in their interpretation of the same data. So I think what you're seeing here with Glass Lewis is really a response to that need for measurable quantitative and qualitative data, and an attempt to give their clients something that focuses a bit more on materiality for company, because that really is SASB's approach, to focus on those metrics that for a particular company or sector are material to the financial performance of the company. So will you see a shift in voting as a result of that? I don't think so. At least not immediately. I think what you will see is the ability for clients to take those measurable, potentially material data points and then make their own determinations on whether a company measures up with what they expect or across a group of peers.
But I think it's interesting that Glass Lewis has gone out and actually picked SASB and kind of really is kind of continuing the trend of SASB being embedded in the in this disclosure regime, and clearly I guess legitimizing it even further. I mean, it's not that it's illegitimate, but really making it almost official that this is the way things are going.
But I think that's interesting because of course SASB's new standards updated for the 77 different industry variants just came out November 7th, and I think that they've spent a lot of time trying to tailor that even more and to respond to a lot of the company, quite frankly, criticisms they got. So I think there have been a lot of companies who have looked at what was proposed initially and sort of said, look, this actually doesn't reflect material elements for at least our specific business for any given individual company. I'm not sure among the preparers, among the issuers, I'm not sure that I would say that it was necessarily a widespread adoption. I think a lot of companies use a variety of different standards in their reporting, and that, of course, as Anne was saying, is one of the frustrations. But it'll be interesting to see how that maps on to how a company thinks about what it really finds important, strategically important for its particular business, and material in a company specific way. So we'll see how that plays out. I also find it very interesting that Glass Lewis chose the specific standard. To be honest, I was a little bit surprised, but
Yeah.
we'll see how that develops.
It's the San Francisco conspiracy, I guess.
I wasn't going to call it that, but okay,
All right, yeah.
we can go there.
Well, it's also interesting. I think if the revised 77, up to date had been released earlier, I think you might have seen companies trying to work them into their proxy disclosure, their 10K disclosure, but especially proxy disclosure, aimed at Glass Lewis. But the timing is such that I think that's going to be difficult.
Yeah.
But
Not impossible.
Not impossible, but
I mean, it's a
totally
nudge.
late.
I think it's a signal for what's to come.
Yeah.
Board diversity is another issue that the proxy advisory firms have kind of dealt with straight on this time, both Glass Lewis and ISS issuing very specific statements, Glass Lewis with actual policy guidance and ISS with asking for feedback on proposed policy. So, Mary, maybe you just want to give an overview of what the two firms came out with and how you think this might impact the upcoming season.
certainly. Basically, Glass Lewis, for this year's annual meetings, has said that they will consider recommending a vote against the head of the Nomination and Governance Committee if there is no women on the board, although they will take into account mitigating factors such as a firm commitment to have a woman join the board before the next annual meeting. Basically, ISS has proposed a very similar guideline, although it won't be effective until board meetings held after February 1st, 2020. So they're essentially, getting on, making part of their guidelines, the swell that has been growing over the last couple of years, and obviously crested in California with California's law about companies headquartered in California having to have a woman on the board or a firm commitment or suffer penalties, which people have very mixed feelings about, obviously. But I think for this year, I think most companies at this point, or many companies in the Russell 3000, which is really who Glass Lewis is focused on, they'll take it easier, I think, on the non-Russell 3000 companies. Many of those companies have a woman on the board at this point, and the companies who don't, frankly, have probably been seeing the handwriting on the wall all along and will seek to come up with some sort of firm commitment, or they'll just flout it entirely. But I think that goes such against the zeitgeist that this will give it a push. Glass Lewis adopting, ISS adopting, but it's been there. It's been growing. It's been there all along.
Yeah, clearly it's nothing new. In fact, probably the proxy advisory firms have bbeen more followers than leaders on this issue.
Particular issue.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. The interesting one, and actually, Anne, I think you mentioned it, is the next step, diversity not just on the board. Well, start with diversity on the board, but not just vis-a-vis gender. But also diversity in the executive, the top executives, the C-suites. I see that issue coming up in the future, and then also gender pay parity and sort of diversity issues on a more employee-wide human capital scale. So I think that women on boards has sort of hit its peak, at least as far as pushing companies towards it, and really now it's looking for what's coming next.
Yeah, I mean, as draconian as people make it out to be, the fact is that only a pretty small minority of boards now have 0 women.
Yeah.
I think in the totality, it's still a small proportion of women on boards, but most companies kind of comply with the one woman. The California bill is going to push that forward.
Exactly.
And so, it sounds like a big statement, but I think in reality, it's not that big a statement. Anne, how do you look at this? The Glass Lewis and ISS developments here.
Well, to your point, I think they really are just following what their clients have already done. BlackRock, State Street, CalPERS, just a few examples of shareholders who've made quite a statement over the last year or two about their expectations. I think Michelle Edkins said, we'd expect to see at least 2 women on boards. Thinking about other things that are being pushed, maybe what the next wave is, certainly agree with going deeper into the ranks, because you don't get women on boards unless you have, people coming up through the ranks, women coming up through the ranks and getting leadership experience. I did read just recently, Norges Bank has made a statement that they expect, and I'm going to paraphrase here, that directors will be independent, qualified, and I think by qualified they meant that a board would have people directly qualified for the business of the company, at least 1 or 2 experts, and then that they would have the time to be engaged. So we may be looking at that broader view of, are the directors really the right people for the company at the right time, which is always that question that investors are trying to answer. Is this board composed of the right people at the right time? And while characteristics like diversity and experience and tenure are flags for that, I think as with so many other things, you can have a board that appears to tick all the boxes, but when it comes to execution, doesn't quite get there. I would equate that actually to some of the governance provisions. So you can have a firm that on paper looks like they are best in class, but then things do happen. Perhaps it was only in writing that they look so good, and the board and management weren't truly focused on the risks that they needed to be
I guess
focused on.
Enron always being the prime example of that. In terms of the shareholder proposals regarding diversity, and you really said this is more of a board composition, not just gender diversity. Sandra, are you seeing, do you think any new varieties will come out? Obviously last year, New York City had a big push on their board matrix disclosure. Anything you're seeing on the horizon that we can expect?
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's anything that I would kind of call out as being likely to emerge. I haven't sort of heard of any particular variants. I did, though, you mentioning the New York City Controller, I did want to bring that up because they've certainly put some proposals out there about the matrix and skill matrix that they are expecting to see. But what's happening behind the scenes is actually a broad brush engagement of the New York City Controller. So following their proxy access push, they basically took all of the same companies that they targeted on proxy access, which, as everybody remembers, was quite a significant endeavor for the New York City Controller, and they did some outreach to all of them to talk about, among other things, diversity on the board. It was a particular focus, and they're doing that around, exactly as Anne was saying, sort of talking about the whole picture of the board and the directors on it and the skills. But among the issues that they're focusing on there is diversity. I also agree with what Anne just said. I think there are a lot of investors right now that are focused on how to assess director effectiveness and board effectiveness, and I don't think they've quite. I don't think that thought process is quite gelled yet as to what sort of measures people will use or what sort of issues they'll really focus on. So I don't really expect to see that this year, but I have heard it from quite a few investors that's something that they're studying and they're thinking about. So I think there is more to come there. I just not quite sure we'll see it this year.
Got it.
What I have seen in clients is an uptick in not interest per se, but in more focused interest or more thoughtful interest in their board evaluation processes.
Yes.
So I think that they have picked up on what's going on. not to be cynical, I'm sure some of them just want more effective boards themselves, but also are seeing what folks are struggling with, and I think are paying closer attention to thinking it through and what we do, and is it really helping, or are we just doing it because NYSE NASDAQ tells us we have to?
Yeah. I'll also just add to that I don't think it's going to necessarily come out in the proposals or the policies and so on this year, but there is a fair amount of research out there that talks about one woman on the board doesn't necessarily have much of an impact, two a little bit more, but it's really when you get 3 women directors on a board that you start seeing a more significant shift in the culture of the board and how it sort of plays out. And I found that echoed in the California law that came out, where for the one female director on the board is just by the end of 2019. Right. Assuming the law stands, and of course it may be challenged on a bunch of grounds, including constitutional ones, but for a board of 6 or more, then the expectation is by the end of 2021 that would have 3 female directors on it. So I found that interesting in that particular law.
Yeah, people have to remember that law actually talks about proportion, not just absolute numbers.
Right.
At this point, let me give... Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Could I just add to something, that Sandra just said that I think is also important? You used the word culture. And when thinking about whether your board is truly effective, and I think this goes back into some of the things that we've seen this year where perhaps culture has not been what it should be, some of the, for lack of a better frame, or a better term, the Me Too moments and high-level executives being let go, or other governance failures that perhaps could not have been addressed by specific governance provisions, but very much could be addressed, should have been addressed by the board being attentive to the culture of the company and being aware of potential risks in how people were conducting themselves or business. So I think going back to the culture and the effectiveness of the board, and if that is enhanced by having a number of women or other diverse candidates, that will continue to get a lot of focus.
Let me give the New York lawyers the CLE special code at this point. It's 11588. So please write 11588 on the verification form, which you will be emailing to Cleary Gottlieb for CLE credit, and that's for live participants. Let's see. More about proxy advisory firm voting policies. Glass Lewis had a pretty lengthy explanation of how they are going to treat the conflicting shareholder proposals. And in particular, they used as a very specific example the special meetings and kind of the percentage of shareholders able to call a special meeting. And how do you how do you see investors and companies reacting to what Glass Lewis has outlined?
Well, my view is that I don't think there'll be a full-scale lockstep adoption, but I think what Glass Lewis points out is really the overall shareholder perspective, that often they will see companies attempting to put in their own provisions that perhaps are not quite as robust as what's being asked for. And then it really comes down to whether what the company's done seems reasonable to satisfy the request of the shareholder. Shareholders look quite closely at whether the protections offered by the proposed shareholder approach are indeed better than what the company's asking. So I think it still comes down to a judgment. I think it's interesting, though, that a proxy advisor is weighing the relative merit of the two approaches and making a judgment call.
I think it was particularly interesting that Glass Lewis has said, what's really most offensive to us is when the management, in response to a shareholder proposal, will put something up for ratification of kind of the existing special meeting level and therefore, in Glass Lewis's view, not giving shareholders the opportunity to kind of improve from the shareholder point of view what their rights are.
And I think that's
Well, and I think they've just clarified how they felt all along.
Yeah, exactly. They actually put it into words what they've been feeling. Yeah.
I also think that's a direct response to how the SEC's policy on how it reacts to no action letter requests from companies in this space, right? I mean, the development, and it really was last year, companies putting up these ratification proposals. That was because of the SEC's statements about, in order to be able to exclude on that basis, you need to have a conflicting proposal where you really can't vote for both, right? The SEC had as its standard, you must be effectively prohibited from or barred from voting for one if you vote for the other, that it would be inconsistent to vote for both. And I think the result of that was companies developing this approach of putting up these ratification proposals with a view that if you ratify the existing, you can't also vote to change it, right? Mm-hmm. I don't disagree necessarily with the Glass Lewis reaction to that, with a shareholder reaction to that's just, that feels sort of like a game, right? But I do think it comes out of this very rigid stance in the no action letter approach for the SEC. So I think now it'll just be harder for a company to try to exclude on that basis. It really takes a conflicting proposal argument is a hard one to make these days.
Yeah, absolutely. Mary, what about the compensation policy changes in Glass Lewis's 2018-19 updates that you've seen? Anything noteworthy?
I think the overall comment I would have is that by and large, Glass Lewis is bringing itself more in line with ISS, picking out specific things that it feel indicates poor pay for performance or poor compensation program design. For example, they've specifically come out against excise tax, golden parachute gross-ups, which is a little bit old news, but they felt now that they had to spell them out. Likewise on multi-year bonus promises, front-loaded awards, recoupment provisions, whether they're just checking the box for Sarbanes-Oxley or whether they're actually going further than that. I think it's interesting. I don't think it'll have as big an impact as it might, because it's following sort of where ISS is already forged. And folks who were paying attention to the ISS on exec comp, Glass Lewis was always a little more black box, and I think they're unblack boxing themselves. I don't know if that's a phrase. One interesting thing, they did come out on director compensation, but instead of sort of following ISS's lead on that and basically saying we don't want it to be excessive, which is a little vague, but at least you sort of knew where they were getting at. Glass Lewis focused on performance-based awards, which I take to mean sort of the performance-based awards that executives receive. If EBITDA hits X, you'll get Y shares, just as a very basic example. But directors don't tend to be given those awards for the reasons that I think Glass Lewis is objecting to. That's directors shouldn't aren't to be encouraged through their comp to achieve certain performance goals. I mean, that's management is there to be incentivized to push forward the company and its well-being and its performance, but board side is oversight. So I was a little surprised by that, but all I can think is that they did have to address director compensation, given all that's going on and the focus that has it's been getting, and this was simply the the direction they chose to go in.
It's segueing into director compensation. Mary, maybe you just want to talk about some of the recent developments and what companies should be thinking about in terms of disclosure or, maybe plan design changes and approvals and stuff like that?
Absolutely. I think the biggest shock in my world was the court's rejection of the Goldman Sachs settlement of their case, because it, first of all, the settlement that Goldman Sachs entered into was interesting in and of itself, and how sort of into the nitty-gritty it got with independent monitors looking over the compensation disclosure. But then to have the court say, that's all well and good, but if they're being paid too much, why aren't there penalties being brought? So that, I thought that was very interesting. I will say that the Goldman Sachs case highlighted something that is more broad spread, focus on director compensation. I think, though, that Goldman Sachs, as opposed to other companies, did have quantity, or quantitative issues. I think most companies have not consider themselves much more middle road, or in the amounts that they're giving to their directors. Most of them benchmark against each other. I think that what you will see, though, and what is clear, is I think the idea of capping director compensation, specifically equity, but more and more total, is definitely going to continue to have legs. I think any company putting up a plan this year that has not already adopted or built in an equity cap on their directors would and should be thinking about building that in. Because the one thing that has clearly come out is when a case about director compensation makes it to the courts, it is not best judgment or business judgment. It's definitely fairness, entire fairness, and that makes a huge difference.
But so for caps on director comp, I mean, what are you seeing there? Are you seeing kind of absolute dollar amount type caps?
I've been seeing mostly absolute dollar amount type caps. The question is whether it relates just to the equity awards they can receive, or the total compensation. Now, it will come as no surprise that the caps are generally rule of thumb. What have we been giving our directors? Let's double it and then go out with that. So it's not they're not necessarily tight caps. But yeah, no, I think that people figure that this is a cheap insurance, if you will, against leaving aside strange facts, against an argument that directors are feathering their own nests and that shareholders have never been given an opportunity to put a cap on or put some sort of limits on directors' compensation.
What about, Anne, how do you think investors are they looking any differently at director compensation these days? Obviously, executive comp has been an obsession for decades now.
Well, I think there have always been some shareholders who've looked at director compensation. I say that with a little bit of bias toward my old firm, because that was actually a calculation done every year for the last 20. But increasingly, I'm hearing other shareholders talk about director pay. I think the issue here is the balance between being able to attract the qualified directors you need, clearly an acknowledgement that being a director has likely never been so difficult and time consuming, so you need to compensate people for the time and attention they're spending. But then the tipping point of when the salary, the equity awards become so generous that there then is a different focus for the director. I actually had one public company director very candidly describe to me a situation where the equity awards gained so much value because of stock price movement that he said it was really difficult to step back and not consider the fact that directors had literally millions of dollars riding on a decision. He said, that's just difficult for people to do. So that balance of compensation that's adequate versus changing the focus to their own self-interest, I think, is a difficult one. And I think a number of shareholders also do look at that benchmarking. I know well at Capital, we ran every few years numbers of average director comp for a company, and it was surprising to me every time we did it, the fact that the outliers were actually very few. But where they were outliers by significant amount.
Yeah, so if they were going to be an outlier, they better go big, or at least that's what they did. But I mean, it's interesting that it continues to be this dilemma of a lot of investors saying, well, we want directors to have skin in the game. Ownership, performance follows ownership. But if the performance is too good, then we're going to be like, oh my God, this is outrageous. So anyway, I think you can tell how I feel about this one. Mary, real quick, 162M, obviously, some disclosure tips here.
Absolutely. Really what companies should be focused on is what they can and cannot deduct. But disclosure-wise, I think the key takeaway here is if you're putting up a plan or discussing a program and you have made changes to it because performance-based compensation exception to 162M has been removed. For instance, there was always a required individual cap, how much somebody could get in a year or under the plan in its entirety. There was, once a performance metric was met and an amount was spat out of the formula, directors couldn't increase it. There were ways around these issues, but still, plans were designed, and there were features of plans and programs that were directly driven by 162M. And now with that gone, I think a company really needs to sit back and think about to what extent does it rid itself of all the sort of, little, traps for the unwary that 162M, put up. But on the other hand, does it want to, throw out all of the things that have become so ingrained, maybe just because of 162M, but that are ingrained at this point? Objective performance measures, not using positive discretion. Individual caps. At this point, shareholders are used to them, and unless companies feel that they really are getting in the way of being able to compensate their executives the way they wish, a company might consider just leaving well enough alone. But the key thing is, I think, if you are going to change them, if you are going to make some sort of change, I think you have to be very upfront about it. Especially if it's in a plan that you're putting up for adoption. I think you have to call out the specific changes that you're making, because I think you will be criticized otherwise for trying to, hide them, hide the, formerly shareholder-friendly aspects that 162M imported into plans. And then changes to programs, if you're going to have any of those, and there's some change you're making because 162M no longer figures in, I think you have to make that very clear.
Got it.
As far as the sort of stock, 162M disclosure, I think that's going to eventually fall away altogether because at some point, it's going to be nothing more than, well, we sort of take deductibility into account, but let's face it, everything over $1 million is non-deductible, so the only way to truly take it into account is to pay under $1 million, and I, don't see that happening, purely for deductibility reasons. I think it will linger around a little bit as long as the grandfather tails off, but after that, I think that'll be the end of 162M.
Got it. Just quick lightning round on pay ratio disclosure. Any reactions from year one, predictions for year two, Sandra?
I know we just heard her talk, but I'm gonna defer to Mary on that.
Coward! I think it's basically, most companies, if not all companies, will stick with the same median employee. So to the extent that you didn't have any employee, uproar over what that...
Hope that person doesn't leave, right?
Exactly. So that number's already out there. And And frankly, unless you have some, real spike in your CEO's compensation due to a change in CEO or some other unusual, change, the ratio is going to be very similar. So I think it's going to be, other than those companies who have something to explain, or who have to, redo the median employee compensation calculation, I think it's going to be a little bit of a snore.
And what about you? Any kind of reaction to the reaction over the pay ratio disclosure as we initially saw them?
I think Mary touched on the most important part. So if your ratio is pretty much the same, there's nothing to say. Where it's different, companies should understand exactly why it's different, and they should be prepared to help their shareholders understand. And there are a lot of good reasons that that number will be different. But the more candid you can be, the more explanation you can give, potentially the more backlash you can prevent.
I also think, actually, the lesson from last year for companies that doing it in the first year really had something to explain was also to preview it for your board early. You don't really want to have your board finding out in February when they're trying to approve disclosures that, oh, by the way, there's this whole explanation about why this is a little odd or looks off or whatever, right? So I think last year, companies that were really thoughtful about this and that had a story to tell previewed that with the board right about now, actually, or maybe even a couple months ago. But and I think that served them quite well. I think that allowed those kinds of companies also had a very thoughtful process around what to say.
Yeah. So we covered a lot here, and unfortunately we're out of time. But I want to thank our panelists, Sandra, Mary, and Anne, for sharing their knowledge with us, and it'll be exciting to see how things play out. Just before we break, I want to announce that we've got a couple of in-person and webcast events for the Governance Center. Today we actually have a cybersecurity working group meeting coming up in about an hour, and if you do want to participate in that and you're a member, let us know, because we have remote participation capabilities. On December 11th, we will be releasing a book discussion webcast, an interview with Stephen Clifford, a former CEO who wrote a book called The CEO Pay Machine. And we'll be having our first Global Benefits and Compensation Roundtable webinar of the year of 2019 on January 31st at noon Eastern. And we'll be releasing our dates for the 2019 Governance Watch series, so keep an eye on that to put them on your calendar. Again, those interested in New York CLE credit, the verification code is 11588. Put that on your form and email it back. Please fill out the survey. CPE credit, fill out put your full name, email address, and specify CPE in the space provided at the bottom of your screen. And thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Governance Watch. We will see you next time.